There are probably a few people who use InDesign for pictures only, but most of us need to put text on our pages. Well, you cannot have text without a text frame, but the good news is that there are lots of ways to make text frames in InDesign. The basic method for making a text frame is to use the Type tool. You choose the Type tool from the tool panel, and then simply click and drag. Notice that as I'm dragging, I get the measurements of that frame in a little gray field to the right of my cursor. That helps me create just the size I want. When I let go of the mouse button, the text cursor is flashing inside the text frame, ready for me to start typing. Now, there are several other tools for making frames as well. Down the tool panel a little bit, you'll see several other tools. For example, the rectangle frame tool. And if I click and hold for a moment, I'll see underneath that tool, there's the rectangle frame tool, the ellipse frame tool, and the polygon frame tool. These technically make graphic frames. That is, if I choose this rectangle frame tool and click and drag out an area, I see a big X in it, and that means it's supposed to have a graphic inside of it. But you know what? InDesign doesn't care. You can easily change one kind of frame into another simply by grabbing the Type tool and then clicking on top of it. Now, notice what happens to the cursor as I move on top of the frame. Out here, where there's no frame at all, I get a kind of cursor that says, well, I could make you a frame if you want. But as soon as I move the cursor on top of this frame that's empty, I get a different cursor. It's kind of a dotted line, kind of a circle or almost parentheses around it. And that dotted line indicates that when I click, it's going to turn this frame, this empty frame, into a text frame. So it's always a good idea to watch that little cursor because it's going to tell you what's going to happen next. When I click, it changes into a text frame, and then again, I can start typing. Now, there's also a set of tools down here that are technically unassigned frames. Once again, a rectangle, ellipse, and a polygon. These are shapes. They're not really designed to have text or graphics inside them. But once again, if I make one, perhaps with this ellipse tool, drag it out, I can turn that into a text frame by switching back to the Type tool and then clicking inside of it. Now I'm typing inside of an oval. Of course, some people don't like it when their graphic frames and their unassigned frames get turned into text frames so easily. So the good news is that Adobe has given us a preference so that you can turn that off if you don't like it. What you do is you go to the InDesign menu on the Mac or the Edit menu on Windows, and you choose the Preferences submenu. Then choose Type. That takes you right to the Type pane of the Preferences dialog box. The Type pane of the Preferences dialog box has a checkbox called Type tool converts frames to text frames. If you turn that off, then your graphic frames and your unassigned frames will no longer change into text frames accidentally. However, I happen to like that feature. I like that it turns into text frames, so I'm going to leave it turned on. It's completely up to you. I'll click OK, and then I'm going to clean up my pasteboard a little bit here by switching back to my selection tool, dragging over all of these frames that I just made, and then pressing the Delete key. Now, there's one more way that you can make a text frame in InDesign, and that is to import a text story, like a Word file or an RTF file. To do that, I'm going to go to the File menu and choose Place. I'm going to go into much more detail about placing stories later on in this chapter, but for right now, all I'm going to do is select this Word document and then click Open. You'll see that it loads a place cursor with the story attached to it. Now at this point, I have two options. I could just click, and InDesign will make a frame for me and load the story into it. Or, let me undo that. I'll press Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows. That reloads the place cursor. And this time, I'm going to drag out a frame. And when I do that, I can control exactly how large the text frame should be. As soon as I let go of the mouse button, InDesign places a story into that frame. Now that you know how to get a text frame, let's take the next step, editing the text inside that frame.